Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for coming. My name is Joshua Sharfstein. I'm the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice and Training here at the school. This is going to be a really interesting and fantastic session. It's part of the Centennial Policy Scholar Seminar Series with our incredibly terrific Centennial Policy Scholar, Congressman Waxman. In order to introduce today and as the moderator, it's my pleasure to turn this over to my colleague, Professor in Health Policy and Management and the Director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy, Dr. Forrest.
So yes, welcome. My name is P.G. Forrest. I'm here to welcome you all for this what is the fifth seminar organized under the political leadership of former Congressman Henry A. Waxman. As you know all, Congressman Waxman is one of the most accomplished legislators in the history of the U.S. Congress. He, as Josh just mentioned, he joined the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health for our Centennial Policy Scholar Program after he represented California's 33rd Congressional District for 40 years in the U.S. Congress. Congressman Waxman has been closely associated with the preparation of the seminar today, and he will share his insights and experience at the end of our session. Also, I would like to add that the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, the Department of Health Policy and Management, wish to thank Francis Ankle, the SC85, whose generous gift makes the Centennial Policy Scholar Program possible. Last fall, I think beginning of October, together with a group of colleagues from the school, we organized the first summit on climate change and public health. It was a great success, and I think convinced all the participants at the summit at the time. We're all convinced that public health will be in balance in the global negotiations over climate change. And I'm sure if you're sitting here today, you're aware that there was an agreement in Paris at the Paris conference on climate change of last December. We thought it will be important to assess the potential impact of this agreement on public health, on well-being, and this is what we will try to do today. We have a fabulous panel of experts who I will introduce shortly, but first of all, we are privileged to welcome as a very special guest speaker, Dr. Todd Stern, who is the special envoy for climate change at the State Department. Dr. Stern plays a central role in developing the U.S. international policy on climate. He's the President's chief climate negotiator, representing the United States internationally, including, of course, at the Paris conference. And before joining the Obama administration, he was at the Center for American Progress, where he focused on climate change and environmental issues, and a partner at the law firm Wilmer Hale, where we serve as vice chair of the Public Policy and Strategy Group. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Todd Stern.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to come to Johns Hopkins. I want to thank also one of the real champions and leaders on this issue and so many other issues for such a long time, Henry Waxman, great friend, and the Waxman-Markey legislation back from 2009 and 10 was enormously important. It got halfway through the Congress, but you took care of your part, Henry. But enormously influential and important at the time, and is still helped point the way for the U.S. in terms of our immediate targets and what we hope to do over the next number of decades. I'm also delighted by the public health focus on this issue. It's something that's been talked about for some time, but it is increasing, and I think enormously important, both because it's very real. You'll, I'm sure, hear about that today, but the impacts of climate change on public health itself, but also as a matter of public communication. I think it's enormously important. When I was in Paris, and I'm going to get to the agreement in just a second, but I had the unusual experience of spending some time with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I don't usually, I don't run in celebrity circles most of the time, but he was there to be shooting part of a new series that there was first round of this last year, and a new round being shot for this year called The Years of Living Dangerously, a series of programs on climate change, and he's hosting one of them on China and wanted to interview me. So I found myself spending some time talking with Arnold, and he was actually very interesting. He was not talking about his new Terminator movie, which I would recommend, but he was really talking about the importance of the right kind of public communication and the importance of not talking about climate change as just this thing that is going to affect us in the distant future, but as something that is immediate, that is affecting public well-being right now, that is affecting the disease and mortality right now. So I think the public health focus is quite important. All right, let me talk for a few minutes about the Paris Agreement. It was, I think, it has been called an historic agreement, and I think it truly was. In a nutshell, here I think are the elements that are the most important. First of all, it establishes the first ever universal regime, durable regime on climate change that is genuinely applicable to all. There have been other agreements that in one way or another have been applicable to some countries, or in a very sort of broad way applicable to everybody, but not in the sense that countries are really expected to and are taking up the obligation to act. Second, it sets us on a path of high ambition. That starts with 186 or 7 at this point countries having put forward targets of what they plan to do to reduce their emissions over either in the 2025 or 2030 timeframe. That's an unbelievable number. I mean, there's 196 countries in this overall negotiation, and I don't think anybody expected a year ago that there would have been anywhere near this number of countries having come forward at this point and to put forward their targets. So that's an enormous step forward. The estimates of where we were in terms of emissions based on existing policy a year ago were about 3.6 degrees Celsius going forward. That's based on a group called the Climate Action Tracker, which is one of the best groups in making those assessments. And this year, then in 2015, 1 year later, based on those targets, they reduced that estimate to 2.7 degrees. 2.7 degrees is way too high still. Our target is 2 or less than 2, but going from 3.6 to 2.7 in 1 year is a lot of progress. The targets themselves, then the structure that was built around the targets is also critical. There are 5-year cycles, both for every 5 years there will be a stock take of how we're doing globally, and then about a year later, a cycle for countries to ratchet up their targets, either to put in a new target if they're at the end of their target cycle, or to review where they are and make an assessment about whether to increase it, or if they decide not to explain why they're staying where they are. There's strong goals that include the goal to hold temperature increase to less than 2 degrees and to strive for even better than that, to strive for 1.5 as the limit. And also a goal for essentially carbon neutrality over the course of this century. The agreement also establishes a strong regime for transparency, which is critical. We have to be able to understand, all countries have to be able to understand what everybody else is doing. So there are now binding transparency requirements with common standards for developed and developing countries. Regular inventories that countries have to do based on international standards, regular reporting for both of those inventories and of the progress countries are making toward their targets, and a robust review of what everybody's doing based on expert reviews, plus a kind of peer exercise as well. And flexibility built into this system, taking into account the different capacities of countries around the world. The new agreement also revises fundamentally the architecture of climate change agreements, the architecture that has been central in the climate change negotiations over the last 20 years. And essentially, there's been a firewall between developed and developing countries. There needs to be differentiation, absolutely, but the kind of differentiation that was built into the climate change negotiations all the way back to the early 1990s is not viable going forward. And so that was, we have been working to change that over time, and a great deal of progress was made on that front as well. Also enhanced focus on adaptation, helping countries deal with and helping people deal with the impacts of climate change that are already happening and that are going to continue to happen no matter how effective we are in reducing emissions, and also robust financial support for countries who need it. So all of those things were embedded in this new agreement, which really exceeded. I would say it was north of what we thought was the best case scenario as we entered the Paris, the final 2 weeks of these negotiations in Paris. Many people have asked me whether we thought we had this pretty much in the bag at the point that we went to Paris. The negotiations, the meeting started on November 30th. The answer is definitely not. This is a negotiation that was kicked off in the Durban meeting. There's a big climate change meeting at the end of every year. And so this negotiation started in Durban in 2011. And coming into Paris, it was not clear, where we were going to land. There had been a very difficult meeting at the sort of one level below the so-called ministerial level in October in Bonn, and we had concerns across a range of issues. I think that we were able to get where we did get based on a number of different factors. Very strong solidarity between the U.S. And Europe, as well as other industrialized countries as a starter. The diplomacy that we have conducted with China over the course of the last few years, most dramatically, including the joint announcement by President Obama and President Xi in November of 2014, where we announced our targets and the Chinese announced theirs, was, I think, enormously important. It sent a message to countries around the world that this negotiation was actually going to really happen. It was going to really get done. You had the tableau of the two historic adversaries and the two biggest players in sort of the two 800-pound gorillas that having come to this point of being able to work quite constructively together. That was a huge, I think, message that sent very positive shockwaves through the climate negotiating world, and I think jump-started the process that led, as I said a few minutes ago, to those 186 countries having put forward their own targets. There was very important diplomatic work done by the president, not just with China, but with respect to Brazil, South Africa. We had India. You had several meetings, 2 visits actually, one to the U.S., one to India, where the president met with Prime Minister Modi. An important meeting actually that we did right in Paris, where the president met with leaders of 5 small island states being among the most threatened in the world by climate change. So all of these things, I think, were enormously important, and we helped to put together what I think I may have coined the term the High Ambition Coalition in Paris. One of the things we were worried about, with good reason, was the interest in some big players to have a kind of minimalist agreement and to not go very far and to kick over to some later date when they were out of the spotlight any discussions for some of the strong measures on mitigation and transparency that we were trying to push for. And I think we quite successfully, we and the EU, worked together with a whole set of progressive players on the developing country side, islands, the least developed countries, a set of progressive countries from Latin America and others to really join together in what became a very, I think, potent coalition in the course of the 2 weeks in Paris. So I have completely lost track of my time. I'm okay now. Okay. So I will bring this to. I guess the only other country that I should mention as being really very important to getting the result was the French. And this was a meeting in Paris. The French had the leadership of these negotiations during the course of the past year, and Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius did, I think, a really extremely good job in driving the negotiation to a successful conclusion. So we have a very important start. I mean, that's the sort of the takeaway. We have a durable agreement. It doesn't do enough, but it sends, I think, a very powerful signal to countries around the world, to civil society, to the private sector, that finally countries in the world have agreed to take this issue on, to go forward in an important way, and in a way that keeps ratcheting up every 5 years, it keeps getting reviewed every 5 years. And I think that this will send that kind of signal. I think it will be important for markets. I think it'll be important for all those who are trying to develop clean energy solutions. Again, just remember fundamentally what we're talking about with climate change. From the solution side is to transform the energy base of the global economy from high to low carbon. That's what this is all about. So let me stop there and let others jump in. Thanks very much.
So, thank you very much, Dr. Stern. So we're now moving to the panel segment of the seminar. As I said before, we have a fabulous panel today, both because of the wealth of expertise and experience and because of the diversity of viewpoint. Adam Sheingate is the chair of the Department of Political Science here at Johns Hopkins. Vicente Navarro is a professor of public policy, sociology, and public studies, but he's also the head of our Barcelona program and campus. Jennifer Martin, the director of the Office for Public Health Preparedness and Response, the City of Baltimore. Greg Dodson is the vice president for energy policy with the Center for American Progress. And last but not least, Mary Fox is a professor with the Department of Health Policy and Management. And the idea here is to give each panelist the chance to have an exchange with Dr. Stern. So, Adam, I will let you start.
Thank you very much. I'm the chair of the political science department, so I thought I would just begin with a minute of what does a political scientist bring to this discussion. And if the job of public health is to tell us what we should be doing with regard to climate change, the job of the political scientist is to explain why we don't do what we should be doing with regard to climate change. And so let me just point out three things that may be on the conversation. One is the difficulty that we have, particularly elected officials have, with long-term goals versus short-term electoral pressures. And that makes climate change a difficult topic to think about or to act on politically. Secondly, is, as we're all aware, the increasing polarization of American politics, such that the two parties are farther and farther apart on most issues, climate change among them, and that makes it often difficult for consensus agreement on pressing public problems. And then the third is just to remember that this is a separation of power system where authority is divided between the executive and legislative branches, between the bureaucracy and Congress. And that means on major issues, concerted action requires agreement across those branches of government, and that can be tricky. And with that, the question that I would ask Dr. Stern is, in the context of the negotiations, it would be really interesting to hear about your perspective with regard to those separation of powers issues. What are the things that you could do in terms of your negotiations through an executive agreement, through the actions of the executive branch, and what are the things, maybe thinking more long-term now, what are the things with regard to action on climate change that really are going to have to involve Congress and acquire congressional action in order to move forward on the goals that you talked about?
Thanks very much. So I guess I would say a couple of things. On the international side, I'm talking on the international side and on the domestic side. On the international side, we have negotiated an agreement which is, by its terms, according to the way it has been structured and phrased, is not an agreement that requires Senate advice and consent. So there may be, I suppose there may be some in the Senate who will have a different view, but I think fundamentally we're on really very, very solid ground and we were extremely careful in that regard. The agreement is essentially a kind of a legal hybrid. There are elements of the agreement that are legally binding, and there are elements of the agreement that are not legally binding. Had it been completely legally binding in all of its elements, then it certainly would have been an agreement that would need to go to the Senate. The reason why and essentially the whole transparency and accountability regime, everything having to do with tracking and making sure that countries have done what they said that they were going to do, all of that is legally binding. The targets themselves are not. And we came to the view that was the right way to go in very significant part because we did not think that we would get there'd be a large number of countries that would not be prepared to do legally binding targets, and also useful for us in the sense of having this be an executive agreement. Now, on the domestic side, so on the separation of powers issue, the nature of the way that we negotiated this agreement says that this is something that can be done on an executive basis, not something that needs to go to the Hill. With respect to the domestic side, which after all is what we need to do in order to achieve the targets that we have announced. The president has been enormously aggressive and enormously effective in putting forward policy and executing policy based on authority that already exists. So you probably have heard of the Clean Power Plan regarding the entire power sector. It's a huge undertaking. That's based on the Clean Air Act. The president has put forward a very far-reaching regulation with respect to the entire transportation sector. We're in the process of increasing our miles per gallon in our fleet from 27 to 54 miles per gallon, which again, a huge advance, and a whole host of other policies that he's undertaken, all based on authority that he already has had. So that's not executive in the sense that he can do these things on his own, but it's executive in the sense that the authority exists based on prior legislation, and he's been able to use that. And that has gotten us pretty far, but in the long run, we will need new congressional action. So the process, the political process, which is going to be tremendously dependent on public opinion, of Congress being ready to act and acting more effectively. Congress is doing, they have done some things. They've importantly extended some tax credits that are very important with respect to the development of renewable energy. That just happened in the recent budget. But in terms of the more far-reaching legislation that will be important over time, that will require Congress.
Thank you.
In the 6 minutes I have been told I'm assigned, I'm going to dedicate half to make a comment and then the other part in the question. I think it's clear that the climate is a major challenge for us, Hopkins. And I have been here 50 years, 5-0. So I tell the young faculty and the students, don't worry, you can survive. And I have seen many, many changes. But I do believe what is happening now is the greatest challenge that Hopkins has faced. And that requires a lot of changes within Hopkins. I think we have to break the discipline lines. That is a problem that cannot be approached discipline by discipline. So Hopkins has to develop a more collegial sense within the creation of knowledge so that we can work together. That is a change at Hopkins that will be needed. The second one that will be needed at Hopkins is a partnership with those who are out in the trenches trying to resolve the problem, and that is primarily the local authorities. And I was very pleased that in Paris was a recognition of the major role of the municipalities. So we have to extend our collaboration with our friends in the Baltimore City Department, Health Department, and others. So we have to break the walls of academia in order to work together with our colleagues who are dealing with that major problem in the trenches, which is primarily the local authorities, but also the state and federal government, and I'll make the question later on. The second is the international dimension. I think it's terribly important that we learn from what happened in other countries. And sometimes we tend to be a little too clavish. So it's important that we develop networks. And I'm very pleased. Some of us had a meeting this morning for 1 hour with colleagues from Barcelona. As you know, we have now a campus, a center in Barcelona, and that collaboration with our sister university in Europe, the Pompeu Fabra University, and also with the city of Barcelona. And we have there experts from the universities and also from the cities. And we're discussing what are the problems that we face. There are problems in common. Everyone is concerned about heat waves, and that is a major problem. Not everyone is concerned about the snowstorms. Barcelona climate is not a problem, but we have it, and you'll see in a few hours. So in that sense, it's very, very important that we develop an international concern, international not only in terms of assisting others, but, and that is the novelty, but also learning from others, which is more needs to be done at Hopkins. So in that respect, that is the other thing. And in that respect, the federal government could help more, could help a lot in terms of developing and helping to develop those international networks of people on the one side, scientists, and the other side, people in the municipalities who are facing that problem enormously. And the third one has to do that we have some knowledge and experience. Let's analyze what happened with tobacco. Remember that we have been successful in the anti-tobacco campaign in the United States, quite successful. And first was the denial. There was nothing to worry about it. Still, that denial exists in the climate change in many quarters. What did the public health community did? Tried to provide information that it was a problem. Now we have also, that is a challenge. We had to educate our citizenry and our authorities. I think usually the authorities need to be more educated than the people in the street who know more, because they suffered. So in that sense, this is a real problem This is something new. It's a real problem. It's going to be the major problem in the 21st century, no question about that. And we have that information from a multidisciplinary point of view. That is terribly important. The second thing, what we did, was to define what is the nature of the adversary, the tobacco industry, and we have a well-defined, and then how to neutralize that, and we did it. And for that, we develop a culture at the street level where tobacco smoking is not a good taste. Well, we had to develop an anti-CO2 culture, okay? That is what we need to develop, and that is the great challenge. Which leads to the question, because that requires a lot of investment from the federal government. Look what happened in tobacco. We had to help our society to go transfer from a tobacco-oriented society to non-tobacco industry. So we invested a lot of money in Arkansas, for example. Tobacco was a key industry, and we had to invest in Arkansas. It was $20,000 million to create jobs for those who work in tobacco, and you had to diversify agriculture, so now they work something else. We have to do the same problem in Nevada, nuclear stations. We need to invest to change that to other types, and that will require a strong public intervention. Don't be naive, don't think the market is going to resolve anything here. This requires leadership from the public authorities, and that is where I came to the question. What you are going to do about it. Now, now that is unfair, it's too broad a question. So let me go to the more strict one. In academia, have you thought in terms of how to help academics like us at Hopkins to have that multidisciplinary approach and apply approach in partnership with the authorities? That requires support from the federal government. And the federal government is not yet equipped to think in those natures. When we look at National Institute of Health, look by disease. That is not how you approach the climate problem. Okay, so that is one thing. The second thing is the leadership in terms of creating those international networks. Okay, we do need those international networks. Have you given some thought about it? I'm sure you have, but share that with us.
Thank you very much. I think interesting comments in many ways, so thank you for that. So on your the specific question, I don't know that there's been, I can't in any event speak to the specific question about whether the federal government is thinking about helping universities approach climate change in a multidisciplinary way per se. I think there's certainly a lot of research funding that goes from the federal government to universities. One of the things that was, I think, quite notable that happened on the margins of Paris, actually on the first day, was a new initiative called, this is a name given to it by Prime Minister Modi, but called Mission Innovation, which involves the US, India, France, and I think altogether about 20 countries who have agreed to double the research and development spending on climate change between now and 2020. So over the next 5 years, double the R&D spending. The US is the top R&D country in the world on this issue, but we've got a long way to go. We don't spend nearly enough on it, and the energy R&D is dwarfed by what we spend, for example, on healthcare. There's a private side of that initiative, which is organized by Bill Gates. So Bill Gates rounded up about 25 very wealthy and committed investors who will be and he proposed to commit something like $2 billion on his own. These are people from around the world who are prepared to take innovations and ideas coming out of labs, the so-called ARPA-E, which is a big energy R&D effort in the federal government, and other places from countries around the world, take good ideas and try to commercialize them. So it's a public-private effort that I think has a lot of potential. I think in terms of the broader global networks, Dr. Navarro mentioned the focus in Paris, and this is, I think, one of the quite good things that the French government did, was to have a focus. They referred to it as Pillar 4. There were 3 other pillars relating to the negotiations, which are not relevant here, but focus on non-state actors. So non-state actors meaning subnational players, states and local, and governors, mayors, and leaders of provinces and cities around the world, as well as the private sector and civil society. So all having a role to play, and all having, in the U.S., we put together a group of, I think, over 100 companies, each of whom made their major companies, each of whom made their own pledges to action that they were going to take, as well as support for the Paris negotiation. There is a need, and I think that there is an intention to for the yearly meetings that, as I said, happen each December or November on climate change, to keep that non-state element, the public, the civil society and private sector and so forth, effort that started with Paris, and to institutionalize that more and more into the climate discussions, which I think would be a good thing. Again, I think there's going to be all sorts of efforts that are stimulated by the fact that we now have this agreement, by the fact that countries have come together in this way. I think the efforts that happen in joint research and development, in activity with respect to public health, and in a whole host of other ways. So that will remain to be developed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start with my comments, I just wanted to say for the students in the room, if you haven't had a chance yet to take a look at the Paris Agreement, I would recommend that you do, because actually the foundations of the agreement are very much based on public health principles. So as you look at it, you'll see that it does take a bottom-up approach. It definitely, there's a lot of consensus building, as Mr. Stern alluded to earlier, in putting the agreement together, and it also includes many legally binding provisions as well as voluntary provisions. So in many ways, it is a public health agreement. So I would just encourage you all to take a look at it if you haven't already. That said, I'm here today as a representative from the City Health Department here in Baltimore and as a local public health practitioner. So I first just wanted to start with a few comments and say that at the local level, especially here in Baltimore, we recognize that climate change is a serious health issue. We are well aware that where a person lives really determines how long they live, social determinants of health. And so in the health department, we're very focused on what we can do directly. And within our department, within our programs, we are directly able to focus on allergens and pollutants and indoor air quality, as well as asthma. And then in my program, which is the Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, we focus more on the disaster effects that we see due to climate change. So we're very involved in extreme heat, extreme cold planning, severe weather planning, and response. And along with that is risk communication. And we spend a lot of time developing communication messages, not just for disaster responses, but also from a preparedness standpoint, and educating the public about climate change and about how climate change is affecting our weather and therefore affecting the events that we experience here in Baltimore. And as my colleague alluded to, we'll be experiencing one of those events here shortly today. And so my question for Mr. Stern then is just thinking as a local health practitioner and employee of a local government, I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on how this agreement affects the role of local public health departments or local municipalities, and what local municipalities and health departments can do to help push this initiative along, put it to the forefront in the public's eye, and to help convene partners and provide the momentum that's needed to keep the initiative going.
Thanks. Well, look, I think that the fact, again, that countries around the world and leaders around the world have reached this agreement is going to inevitably, as I said before, it sends a signal to players around the world, sends a signal to the private sector, but I think it also sends a signal to local governments. I mean, if you're a governor, if you're a mayor, if you're working in a department in any of those jurisdictions, the notion that this has now happened, I think, is itself a real boost to your capacity to then take action in whatever way that's relevant, whether you're working in public health or areas involving energy use or other related areas. I think it provides a boost to your ability to get support. I certainly would hope that that's the case. I mean, if you think about at the state level, looking at some of the governors, for example, who have been very active on this issue in their own states, whether it's Governor Cuomo, Governor Brown in California, Cuomo, New York, or any number of others, the fact that this has now happened globally, I think, puts an imprimatur on their efforts to carry action forward. And I would hope that would filter down at the city level too. There have been mayors around the world who have been very active on this issue. When he was mayor of New York, Bloomberg was great. But there are many around the U.S. and around the world where that's true. So I think that again, this is going to be, the problem is not going away. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And the degree to which people come to focus on it and come to focus on it as something that needs to be addressed now, and is not something that maybe they would worry about in the future, is really critical. And the message of the impact on well-being and public health is going to be critical as well. So, I would hope that what's happened will strengthen everybody's hand at the local level, as well as broader levels to be able to take action.
Great.
Great, thank you. Climate change is a particularly challenging issue in ways that so many other issues are not, because it really takes a global action to prevent the worst effects. And without action by other countries, you have a harder time arguing for domestic action. And without domestic action, you have a harder time arguing that other countries should take action, because anyone acting alone will not solve the problem. And so I think this administration has done a really superb job of moving forward on both fronts in a way that's mutually reinforcing. And so I just wanted to begin by thanking you, Todd. I know you personally had tremendous commitment and effort to make this a success over the last few years, and really thank you for that. You mentioned in your opening comments the transparency elements of the agreement, and I was hoping to follow up on that a little bit. For anyone who follows the U.S. Senate closely, you can easily be forgiven for being confused by what you see. I was a congressional staffer for about 19 years, and for most of that time, the folks who opposed action on climate would argue we should not take any action on climate, we should not do an international agreement because we can't trust the other countries. And we heard that refrain over and over the years. over the last year, it really shifted, and it shifted in a pronounced way after the U.S. and China announced that they were going to be working together on climate change in a way that for the first time we saw the developing world and the developed world kind of express a acceptable vision for a low-carbon future. And the remarkable thing that we saw the Senate Majority Leader actually contacting other countries and saying, you shouldn't agree to a climate change agreement because you can't trust us. It was a bizarre episode, and it really illustrates the important role that trust plays in all of these efforts to make progress. And I know you personally worked very hard from when you first took the office to make sure that there was a transparency framework involved in this so that we could see what other countries were doing, we'd have some faith in that, they could see what we were doing. So my question is really, could you tell us a little bit about how that played out in the negotiation? Maybe you could give us a glimpse into how easily acceptable that was to the various countries involved, but also, despite the significant accomplishment of having it incorporated into the Paris Agreement, this will be an issue that continues to be fleshed out in coming negotiations. And if you could give us a hint of what you think we can expect in the future on transparency, I think would also be very interesting.
Thanks very much, Greg. Well, it was a huge issue, as you say. I have been focused on the transparency issue from the beginning. My very first meeting on the Hill after I took this job was in probably February or March of 2009, and it was with Senator Kerry, my current boss, and who's been a champion on climate change from the very beginning, from probably the late 80s. And he said to me right away, you've got to focus on transparency because people, even if you get some kind of deal, people aren't going to believe it. You're not going to believe that China and others are taking action unless there's a system of reporting and review and so forth that gives people confidence. So I probably had that issue in my head even before that meeting, but I definitely had it in my head after that meeting, and we have worked on it ever since. And back in Copenhagen actually was enormously important, even though it was broadly regarded as a failure, and in some respects it did fail, but it did some quite important things, and it included the fact that for the first time there were developing countries, by no means all of them, but some major ones, who agreed to take some steps to reduce emissions and to be subject to some sort of international transparency regime, although not spelled out. In the years that followed Copenhagen, that was spelled out, but in a way that was a step forward compared to the nothing that existed before, but still not adequate. And it was spelled out initially back in that 2010-11 period in a way that was very much bifurcated. So there was one system for developed countries, and that was actually something that had been going on all the way back till from the earlier 90s, and a system that was related but a good deal weaker for developing countries, and very little with respect to inventories, which are the kind of the foundation stone for transparency, for understanding what a country is doing. What are their emissions? Where are they coming from? How do they look over their whole economy? And also, there was not any real requirement to report on progress you were making toward a target. There was a requirement that you report on things you were doing, but not whether you're making progress toward what you were toward a target that you undertook. So there was a lot of resistance in these negotiations by developing countries to changing that system that was, again, an improvement over what had existed before, but still quite inadequate for a regime that we were hoping to see as durable and lasting for decades. And there was a lot of patient and persistent work and coalition building that had to be done in order to move that discussion forward to the point where we got, in the end, I think a very strong agreement on these issues. Even in Paris, there was a push by some countries to have just a few lines, essentially saying we're going to establish an enhanced transparency regime, and the details will be done later. And we opposed that because we knew that this was a moment. This was when the spotlight was on. This is when we had to get enough guidance, enough clarity in Paris, so that the more detailed guidelines that certainly would have to follow, as Greg said, you need to spell things out in some more detail, would be spelling them out on the basis of quite strong principles that were already agreed to, rather than finding ourselves right back into the old developed country this, developing country that debate that would happen in the guidelines discussions, not with as much focus on countries, had we not spelled out principles clearly in the Paris Agreement itself. So this was, I mean, in many respects, this was, I guess there's a, there's a competition for what was the biggest issue in Paris, but for us, this was certainly one of the top two.
Mary.
So to pick up on some of the other values that are incorporated in the agreement, as Jennifer mentioned and as we've been discussing, transparency, you have a ripe audience here of people who know about a right to health, of people who are working for equity, sustainability, and also more of the structure that you were referred to in your opening remarks for implementation and capacity building. So, I would ask you, speaking to a room here full of world citizens trained in implementation and capacity building in public health, what would you give us as our priorities or our marching orders moving forward?
Well, I think that capacity building is a huge issue and one that did get a fair amount of focus in Paris and does have ongoing work that Paris calls for. I mean, capacity building basically referring to the ability of countries to develop in-country capacity to do all sorts of things. I mean, that can be everything from the capacity to do inventories and do the kinds of things that need to be done in order to create transparency in your actual climate efforts, to capacity for building greater resilience in your country, to the impacts of climate change, capacity with respect to dealing with extreme events. So capacity building really across a quite broad range of issues. There's a provision in the agreement that calls for I think in the first instance, a committee to focus on what kind of new and enhanced capacity building measures and structures ought to be developed. And we, just on, not to go too much back into the transparency issue, we proposed during I think in the fall for the first time, the notion that we ought to provide specific capacity building capability with respect to the transparency issue that I was talking about a minute ago. So, I think that this is a quite critical feature of the agreement for a great many countries. If you think about where the emissions come from, once you have maybe the top 20-25 countries, counting Europe as one entity, the EU, you probably have something close to 80% of your global emissions. For a lot of countries around the world, the thing that matters by far the most is their ability to adapt and build resilience and deal with the impacts of climate change that are already starting to come at them. It will also be important for those countries. Hopefully, countries that need to develop will develop, and it's important that they develop in a way that is more low carbon rather than more high carbon. But in terms of immediate needs and immediate focus, these issues of adaptation and resilience building are key, and having the funding that will allow for good capacity building, and then the expertise to help build that is going to be, I think, quite critical. It's you need money, and you don't want to throw the money away. So you need both of those things in order to get to get what's needed around the world.
Thank you. We have time for questions because the fabulous panel has been so disciplined. We have time for questions from the audience. So please, if you have questions for Dr. Stern or for the other members of the panel, please, the only thing I will ask is to tell us who you are. So, Brian? Yo, Josh? No? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. It's difficult to see the...
It's probably difficult to see and difficult to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you, Annabelle. I really enjoyed your thoughts and input. And I wonder if we could maybe focus specifically in following up on this last discussion about the public health capacity. I mean, I am not an expert in any way in climate change. I'm in health policy and bioethics. But thinking about this audience, what are those biggest dangers? Is it water? Is it sun and skin cancer? I mean, what do we see as the most likely public health implications of the change in climate?
So now that you're finished, you have a microphone.
Okay, so that gave me a chance to run a draft. So I'm Holly Taylor. I'm in Health Policy and Management and the Bioethics Institute. Thank you for all your comments. I wanted to perhaps have you guys talk about what are the most likely catastrophic public health implications of climate change. Is it water management? Is it skin cancer due to sun exposure? I mean, are there things that we should be, are there priorities perhaps that you could help us think about in our own work or our own lives?
Who's that for?
Mary, yeah, maybe you
Okay, sure. So I'm currently working with the CDC Climate and Health Program, and we're doing some strategic planning with them. And in the course of this project, what is great for me is that we do outreach to cities and states and counties and talk to the public health practitioners. One of the challenges of our climate change work is that impacts are regional and within regions local. For example, we spoke with representatives from Alaska where permafrost is melting and they have trouble mobilizing emergency services because the helicopters can't land or take off in the mud, kind of thing. And that those impacts are different from the extreme heat events that we may experience here in Baltimore. So it's really everything, anything, and it depends on where you are.
Maybe I add a word as well, and I do not pretend to expertise on this issue, but I think generally what people talk about in a very broad sense in terms of the dangers of climate change, and these, you can see these obviously affecting public health, is heat, extreme heat events that can be enormously damaging, risks of drought and flood, which are increasing. With respect to the huge numbers of people who live near coastlines, over time, and this is less immediate, but on the other hand, really quite scary. The increase in sea level rise, which in turn increases the damage of storm surges and things like that when there are big events. Water is increasingly becoming an enormous issue, and it's going to unfortunately get to be a bigger and bigger issue worldwide. And climate change, it hasn't caused that, but it contributes to the problem of water shortage. There's an overlap as a practical matter often with conventional pollution, because if you think about the causes of climate change, which largely involve the burning of fossil fuels, if you're burning coal, you're burning oil, then you're getting the CO2, but you're also getting a bunch of other pollutants that come with that. You have, I think, very significant impacts with respect to asthma. And then you also have the increase of more tropical diseases that start to come in effect north, right? So that you things like dengue fever that wouldn't, where the carriers of those diseases wouldn't exist in less tropical climates, start to move north and spread those sorts of diseases. So that's just a short, it's actually not, it's not problems from sun. That's an ozone problem, but there's no shortage of major issues that play into public health.
You will have you will have a microphone so that.
My name is Paloma Navas, and I'm in the Department of Health Policy and Management. And I would like to know which is the individual impact. Like when we are ordering food and we get food that has 3 layers of plastic around it, that was grown in a way that consumes so much energy. When we are using a fork for like 2 minutes and throwing it away, how much does that impact climate change versus this big policy industrial kind of perceptions when you are talking about industry or governments? How can we change? Or is it necessary that we change the way we live our daily lives? Or is our impact very small, or is it large? Because I feel there is like a double conversation here, one in a very high level, and another conversation about our daily lives, and I don't see much going on in our daily lives yet. And I'm not sure if maybe I'm, too worried about things that are really small. Thank you.
Well, look, I think that, I guess I would say a couple of things. There are things that are small that get multiplied by millions and hundreds of millions and billions obviously become important, and the kind of car you drive matters, and the kind of all sorts of things that you buy matters. The light bulbs you use matter. All of those things matter when you look at them in the aggregate. So I think that everything that has to do with using energy more efficiently is what we're trying to do, and policy, the sort of rules of the road that get set by governments, whether national governments or state or local governments, that push in that direction are important. But to the extent that people can also sort of internalize the need to use things in a more efficient way, and again to buy the right sorts of things and the right sorts of products and energy and save energy, I think that's all important. I also think that the other thing that is enormously important at the individual level is to make demands, in effect, to have public opinion move so that their elected representatives know that there's a cost in not taking action on climate change. I mean, you're the expert on what moves Congress, but from my less expert view, but having hung around politics for quite a while, members of Congress ultimately move when they think that that they need to in terms of building support or keeping support among the public. So it's both action that you take in your own lives, but also in essence action as voters and people being represented by elected officials. All of that, I think, matters.
Vicente, very briefly.
I think that Paloma's observation is a very good one in terms of connecting the macro with the micro, the general with the daily lives. Because, let's see, it seems to me that one of the basic problems is the whole society, the whole economy is based on a certain form of energy. That is the origin of the problem. It's based on non-renewable sources of energy. And the whole society is constructed on those bases. And that is the great challenge, to change that society. The source of energy has to be renewable and not contaminating. That is an enormous, huge problem. And the impacts can be overwhelming. How much of an investment we make as a society against terrorism? Enormously. Terrorism has become a major thing. Look, it's likely, I don't want to sound catastrophic, but it could happen in the coming hours that Baltimore is without electricity for 3 days. That is terrorism, you see. That is going to have a huge impact on the quality of life of our citizens. And that could happen in question of hours. It's a major storm, and how Baltimore goes without electricity for 3 days. Look, imagine how many terrorists would require in order to produce that, okay? And we are not, that is the nature of the challenge. So in that respect, is a basic change in the way how society is structured. And that has implications in terms of consumption, in terms of production, in terms of that. That is the greatest challenge the United States has faced. Forget about terrorism. Sorry, I don't mean forget it. But comparatively speaking, what we have is much, much worse than terrorism, okay? And that is where your question is quite right. What has to do with the sandwich I'm having? Yes, it has to do, because the form of energy that creates that sandwich at the end is the root of the problem, you see. So the challenge is to change the forms of energy that sustains the economic activity in the country. And that is a huge, huge, huge major challenge. And I don't know where we'll have time for that, because it is quite likely, if not in a few hours, I can guarantee that we'll reach a point that Baltimore is going to be in electricity for several days. I don't know what's going to happen this year or several, and that is, imagine for a moment what would happen without electricity in Baltimore for 3 days. That is an authentic disaster. Mortality will increase considerably, no question about that. And that is where Joshua was saying, we have just half an inch this night, and already a lot of problems. We have 20 inches. That is the nature of terrorism, you see. That is overwhelming.
Thank you very much. So I will invite Congressman Waxman to share his observation, but before that, I think we should all thank our panel for a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Forrest. I'm delighted to be here and to be a participant and an observer of what our panel had to say today, and I thought they did an excellent job. Dr. Stern has been the face of America in these negotiations. It's led to the successful conclusions in Paris. We owe him a debt of gratitude for all the work that he's done. It didn't happen overnight. It took many, many years. I was at the Kyoto conference when we thought we had a solution, and it didn't work. Now we have an agreement that I think will work. When we talk about climate change, it's not something in the future. It's something that's happening right now. Greenhouse gases go into the air and they don't disappear. They stay there, and we're adding more to it every single day. And what the scientists are telling us is at some point the accumulation of greenhouse gases will get to a place where we won't be able to do anything to stop the terrible consequences that are feared the most. Now, we're seeing consequences. We're seeing a lot of it right now. We're seeing it in weather conditions. We're seeing it in our lives where we see new diseases that we never contemplated in certain parts of the United States. We're seeing it in storms and droughts. We're seeing it concerns over the military when they're trying to make preparations. We're seeing it in foreign policy when people are likely to be migrants all around the world because they can't live where they've lived in the past. So it's going to affect us in many, many ways, and it is basically, more than anything, a threat to public health. Greg Dodson described in his question, what do we do in the United States, and how can we deal with something where the rest of the world isn't involved? Well, with the construct of the Paris Agreement, we have agreements by other countries to work with us and not for us to do it alone. And in Kyoto, the Senate passed a resolution, no agreement should be reached unless everybody was going to be part of it. So we said, we're not going to do anything unless other countries are going to do something. Other countries said, why should we do something if the United States was not going to do something? This is a great deal of maturity that we saw in the international arena. We cut off our noses to spite our face. Now, in the United States, there's a lot that we can do. And we proposed a bill called the Waxman-Markey bill that would have put a cap on the total emissions that cause climate change, and then try to invoke a lot of the private sector decision-making to make that transformation from a non-carbon intensive energy environment so that our whole economy would move in a different direction that would give us a more sustainable planet. We proposed that. We got it through the House by the narrowest of margins, and then we couldn't get it through the Senate, primarily because a bill to pass the Senate required 60 votes. We had a majority, and President Obama was ready to sign it. But we do have a law on the books that I know a lot about because I fought to strengthen that law for over a decade when we were amending the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act was originally adopted in 1970 with a focus on the issues of the urban areas with a lot of smog. But we want to make sure we don't sacrifice the clean air in areas that didn't have a problem. The attainment areas and the urban areas were the non-attainment areas for standards to protect the public health. Well, the revisions that we enacted in the Clean Air Act was to strengthen that effort to clean up the air in dirty air areas, to do something about toxic air pollutants that were causing birth defects and cancer, to do something about the deterioration of the upper ozone layer, which is another serious threat. We have a lower ozone, but then there's an upper ozone layer, and as that deteriorated, a lot of the sun's emissions could come in and cause a lot of havoc. And then we wanted to do something about the acid rain problem, which was the sulfur emissions that were carried long distances. To deal with that, by the way, we adopted a cap-and-trade system where we limited the amount of sulfur emissions, and we told the industries, you have to figure out the way to achieve it, those reductions in sulfur emissions. And it was very, very successful. There was an article last week about how successful it has been. We proposed to do that for the carbon and the greenhouse gases. We couldn't do it. But there are other provisions in the Clean Air Act that give the president a lot of authority to act on his own. Congress is now controlled by people who deny the existence of climate change. They don't think it's happening. They don't think it's a threat. They don't want to be bothered by it. It's amazing how they deny science and deny reality. Some are now saying, oh, yes, there's a problem, but it's not man-made. Well, Congress cannot pass any law on this subject now. When we tried the Waxman-Markey bill, we had a strong majority of Democrats in the Congress. Now we have a minority of Democrats in both houses. So the president said after his reelection, either Congress will act or he will act. And Congress has not acted, nor is there any real prospect for Congress to act. And the president has the ability to use the Clean Air Act under a decision by the Supreme Court, which was a 5-4 decision, that said if the carbon emissions are pollutants that cause harm to public health and the environment, if EPA makes that finding, they must regulate to reduce those emissions. Now, that was a decision given pretty much the Supreme Court that we have now in a Massachusetts case. And the George W. Bush administration, EPA, looked at the issue and made the finding, which would have required regulation, but the White House, under President George W. Bush, didn't want to even receive those findings because they didn't want to act. Well, EPA has made the finding now, and under that finding, we can regulate the pollutants that cause greenhouse gases and climate change. Well, how do we do this? There are a lot of ways we can do it, but Congress is not willing to do it. But there's another provision in the Clean Air Act that's getting a lot of attention lately. It deals with foreign international agreements, ironically enough, an international agreement. It's Section 115 of the law, and it says whenever there's an international agreement where there's reciprocity between countries in achieving reductions of pollutants, that the EPA can start regulating. And EPA can start regulating in a way that can ask the states to do what they're required to do under the Clean Air Act, which is adopt their own implementation plans. If they don't, the federal government can set in place an implementation plan. The Clean Air Act also has a section that's now being relied on to adopt the power plant rule, which this administration has adopted. The leading source of carbon is coming from the utilities. And so the administration's proposed that there be reductions in the energy sector, and they give a lot of latitude to the states to how to achieve those reductions. That's now being challenged in the courts. If Congress won't act, the president said he would, and he is finding the tools to do it, not by executive action just because he'd like to do it, not by fiat of making things up, but by enforcing existing laws. That's what will be happening for the U.S. to achieve its goals. The president and the next administration will have to carry forward, and it will make a huge difference who the next administration is, just as it made a huge difference after President Clinton embraced the Kyoto Agreement and President George W. Bush, first sign of unilateralism in foreign policy, said, we're not bound by it, we're not going to pay attention to it, and we're going to do whatever the energy sector, fossil fuel energy sector wants us to do. So if we get the next administration following the path of this one, they will either get Congress to cooperate or they'll have a lot of tools to move forward. This is an enormous danger. When you can talk about all the consequences of climate change, it could be very, very scary. It shouldn't paralyze us. There's a lot we can do and a lot we will do, but we see the work being done here at Johns Hopkins in the public health world about efforts we can do to mitigate the damage, and we see a lot of efforts in the government at federal, state, local areas to try to reduce those pollutants. You can see the presentation with the Eiffel Tower. It says 1.5 degrees. That's the goal. If the world can reduce the greenhouse gases to 1.5 degrees, we will achieve what the scientists tell us we need to get to in order to prevent this disease, maybe it is a disease, but this climate change pollutants from getting beyond our control, where no matter what we do, it will take on a life of its own. We have to control our fate. And to me, the issue is, why would anybody want to take a chance on destroying the one atmosphere that all of us share? We have a clear responsibility, and we have people willing to live up to that responsibility. And people here have to recognize that you can play an important role in the School of Public Health as you move forward working with the academics to give us the ideas and the further tools to achieve that goal. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Congressman Waxman, for your leadership and guidance. Just a few words. First, I want to thank Geoff Sharfstein for his brotherly support during the preparation of this event, and also all the people that have been involved. You cannot imagine the number of people you need to actually put together 1 hour and a half of conversation. Please join us in March for a series of special events that are scheduled during the Health Policy and Management Centennial Month. It will feature Congressman Waxman and plenty of other fantastic expert guests. On March 8th, we will take a look at drug pricing. On March 23rd, we'll discuss the Affordable Care Act and its impact 6 years after the landmark legislation was enacted. Thank you for all of you to being here today. Please reduce your personal ecological footprint, and have a good day. Bye-bye.